All right. Well, another great wedding church besides this one in St. Stan's is St. Mary's Star of the Sea. Perhaps some of you got married there. Many brides want to walk that aisle. And Bishop Boyer came to St. Mary's Star of the Sea this past May to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the construction of that beautiful church. And many people marvel at its size, its arches, its architecture. But as you're standing in front of the very imposing edifice, above the rose window in very large 2 feet tall concrete letters, it says in Latin, Domus meus, domus orationis est. What does that mean? It's the last verse from today's first reading. It's Isaiah saying, my house will be a house of prayer for all nations. Jesus himself repeated those words when he cast the money changers out of the temple to cleanse and to sanctify that holy and sacred space where they were sinning, right under the roof of God's house. My house will be a house of prayer for all peoples. We have to remember that. It's always been God's will to send his Son to save everybody who wants to be saved, that is. Not everybody will accept what the God of Jesus Christ so freely offers, forgiveness and salvation. But the door is open, and that's the lesson, that is the takeaway today, as in each reading we hear discussion about the Gentiles, which was broadly defined in Jesus' time as anybody who was not Jewish, either by faith or by blood. The Pharisees, they believed that God would only send his Son to save the Jewish people, but not all of the Jewish people. And so then it was mind-blowing for them to see Jesus always and everywhere offering his hand in friendship to everyone. It's one of the reasons they thought he couldn't possibly be God, because why would God love someone like that? Especially someone that was considered by the Pharisees to be unlovable, untouchable, and unclean. When the Pharisees weren't following Jesus to find fault with him, to accuse him of treason or blasphemy or both, they were studying the Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. They had much of it memorized. In Hebrew, you read from right to left. So they read what we would call from back to front. They knew it backwards and forwards, and yet somehow the Pharisees managed to miss the many places where in the Old Testament, like Isaiah today, it did say specifically that when God sent his Son, he was coming to save everyone from every country, from every continent, from every culture, from every century, not just the Jewish people. I love to draw the New Testament correlations that we can find all the way back in the beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis. In Genesis, we can find a defense of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In Genesis, we can find the seeds of the Eucharist. But we can also find God's plan that he would save everyone, not just a select few who were considered to be worthy enough or Jewish enough. And so if we went back to Genesis, we'd see there's 2 covenants that God makes in that book. The first, of course, with Noah after the flood, where the rainbow, that used to be a Christian symbol before it's been co-opted for other reasons. It was a symbol that God would never again use rain to destroy the earth. But the second covenant made in Genesis is chapter 12, where we have God telling Abraham at 80 years old, set out into the desert. He didn't tell him where he was going. He didn't tell him whether he'd ever come home again. He was setting out from Iraq to Israel to become the father, not just of one nation, but the father of every nation. And even though Abraham was 80, even though he had no kids, it is his faith. That's why we call him our father in faith. He trusted that if that was God's will, if that was God's plan, then he would go wherever God told him to go. And in chapter 12 of Genesis, while he's out there on the desert road, what does God tell him? Abraham, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And this is the important part. All the communities of the earth shall find blessing in you. That meant that just as Jesus is the Son of God, and we call God the father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jesus is part of that same family tree. Matthew started his gospel telling us all about the family tree of Jesus with his genealogy. And so right there in Genesis, it's announcing that the descendants of Abraham would lead all people to salvation. And there's plenty of evidence in the Old Testament, especially in Isaiah, where we find more proof that God intended Gentiles to be included in the offer of the kingdom. The Pharisees, they simply choose not to believe that and to refuse to accept it. Their discussion with Jesus today, as he is greeted by this Canaanite woman who has a daughter possessed by a demon, only makes more sense when we consider the verses we have not heard. For the last 2 Sundays, we've been in Matthew chapter 14, where we had Jesus multiplying loaves and fishes, and last Sunday, Jesus walking on the water and Peter sinking like a stone. Then we get into chapter 15. And in the first 20 verses of chapter 15 of Matthew, the Pharisees aren't just finding fault with Jesus, they're also after the apostles. Why? Because they don't wash themselves correctly or frequently enough, and they are not fasting all the times the Pharisees think one ought to be fasting. And so they get locked in this heated debate with Jesus about what makes someone unclean. And the Pharisees were worried that jugs and kettles, utensils, and beds could make someone unclean, but especially being around unclean people. Jesus made it very clear at the beginning of Matthew chapter 15, Pharisees, you blind guides, it is not what goes into a person that makes them unclean. It is what comes from his heart. And Jesus knew the hardened hearts of the Pharisees. Their very name means separated ones, and they preferred it that way, and it was by their choice, because they didn't believe anyone else was good enough to breathe the same air as them. And so that's the problem. Not only do the Pharisees refuse to believe that Gentiles can be saved by God and have a place in his kingdom, they don't even think that all Jewish people will be holy enough or righteous enough to fit through that narrow gate. They have no love of God or of God's people because they are too in love with the law and too in love with themselves. We call it pride and self-righteousness. And so then, that's the story that immediately precedes Jesus arriving at Tyre and Sidon and talking to this Canaanite woman. The Pharisees have followed him there, even though their law says they shouldn't. They're willing to break the law if it means that they one day can silence Jesus for good. That's why they'll eventually break the biggest law of all, thou shalt not kill, and having Jesus put to death. But at this point, they'll follow him anywhere, not because they are his disciples, but because they believe he's doing the devil's work, and they intend to prove it. And thus, once more, Jesus goes where the Pharisees say you shouldn't, Gentile towns, and talks to people that the Pharisees say you ought not, Gentile people. He goes into Tyre and Sidon. Today, that would be in Lebanon. And Jesus meets this woman. What does she say? The Pharisees, who are Jewish, they don't show any respect to Jesus, but this woman calls him Lord, Son of David, and she bows down before him. Lord, because she believes he is God. Son of David, because she believes he is a king. And so she shows the proper respect. She kneels at his feet to ask for this blessing that she believes that she, a Gentile, and her daughter, a Gentile, can receive from this King of the Jews. And that is to get that demon out of her daughter. But at first, Jesus resists her. He won't speak to her. Then, on her second attempt, he says, I was sent only the lost sheep of Israel. And then on the third try, he said, it is not right to give the dogs the food from the table that is meant for the children. But she persists. She is so determined that he and he alone can heal her daughter of this demon. And she said, even the dogs get the scraps that fall from the table. She's willing to settle for even a crumb of Jesus' power because she believes that power is so great. Her faith was challenged, her faith was tested, but her faith was rewarded. Because at that moment when Jesus says, great is your faith, woman, her daughter becomes well, and the demon is cast out. And that is Jesus doing exactly what the Pharisees said he shouldn't and couldn't, and that is offering healing and salvation, forgiveness, hope, and help to a Gentile. And that's what Jesus was always about, a good shepherd who would leave the 99 to look for that little lamb that was most lost, wounded, and wandering. And he didn't worry about whether they had Jewish blood. He wanted everyone that was made by God to know that he is God's son and God's answer to every prayer and the fulfillment of every hunger and desire of the human heart. But the Pharisees would have none of it. We look down our noses at the Pharisees. We say, boy, they were pretty judgmental. But there are Pharisees still in the world this day that still believe that other people have taken the wrong path. And we play judge, jury, and executioner in their lives. We think some people are not worthy to sit with us. We expect some of these people will not make it to the heavenly banquet. And sometimes we don't even want them to. And yet we have to try to have the love of God in Christ in dealing with everyone, not just those who are nice to us, not just those who are kind, not just those who are good, not just those who are popular. But as Jesus told us elsewhere in the gospel, the sun from the sky falls on the just and the unjust. Rain falls on the sinner and the saint. So too, we have been freely and frequently forgiven of all of our faults and failings. And we can't stand in judgment of someone else because of their sins, like the Pharisees did when they admitted of nothing, that they did wrong and didn't think that anyone else did anything right. September 26th, just over a month from now, America's going to get a new canonized saint, Fulton Sheen. Hopefully you have heard some of his speeches or read some of his writings. If you're getting on in years, maybe you remember him on television back in the 1950s. In the early days of television, there were really just 2 channels, and everybody watched them. Now we have 2,000 channels, and we say there's nothing on TV. But in the early age of television, you had Life is Worth Living with Fulton Sheen, and you had Milton Berle. And so many people chose to watch Fulton Sheen dressed in a long cape rather than Milton Berle dressed as a woman. But in any event, Fulton Sheen said before his death, there were 3 things that would surprise him about heaven. 3 things. The first thing, he said, all the people that got in. Because if he had been St. Peter at Heaven's Gate, this one wouldn't have made it. That one wouldn't have made it, because there were plenty of people he didn't care for, and there's plenty of people he didn't like. And so he didn't think they were worthy of salvation. But God did, because God made them and sent his son to save them. The second thing Fulton Sheen said would surprise him about heaven, all the people that were missing. All the people that in this life he admired and wanted to imitate, wanted to spend time with, wanted to get close to, because everyone else did. Because they were powerful, because they were popular, because they were beautiful, because they were wealthy. They could have had the hardened, soiled heart of a Pharisee on the inside, but by all appearances, they had it made in the shade. And yet because they were storing up for themselves only earthly treasures instead of heavenly ones, they fell short of goal, they could not cross the finish line, and they didn't make the cut. But beyond all that, Fulton Sheen, soon to be a saint to the Catholic Church from our very own United States, said this: the thing that would surprise him most about heaven is if God let him in. And that's perhaps the holiness and humility with which we need to approach salvation, and to spend more time trying to get ourselves in than to keep other people out.